And now we'd like to turn our attention to Don Simonis, who is not only representing Utah and the Bureau of Land Management, but his 20 years of work in repatriation. Don?
Thank you. My name is Don Simonis. I'm an archaeologist out in southeastern Utah for the Bureau of Land Management. Pot hunting capital of the United States. And we've still got looting going on, unfortunately. It's something we're trying to deal with between education and law enforcement, but it's terrible. So why am I here today? Well, I was surprised to get a call about 8 months ago, and inviting me back here for this symposium. And I was very pleased to be invited. And the reason I'm here mainly is to tell you pretty much about a reburial that we did through the Bureau of Land Management with the National Museum of the American Indian and 3 other museums on public land. And we think that it went well. It was a success, and I hope we can do a whole lot more of it. By the way, I'm really pleased to see so many museum people here today, because you people are the ones who are going to be working with the tribes and with people like me who will allow reburial in places. Just give you a brief history of our situation. What went on about 2.5 years ago in May of 2012. Again, I got an email saying that the National Museum of the American Indian had contacted the Bureau of Land Management Washington office and was interested in finding a location for the reburial of several items that had been excavated from southeastern Utah back in the 1890s. A certain family by the name of Reburial was heavily involved, and they had been working on this for the museum and tribes for about 15 years, having meetings. And so in May of 2012, went back to Albuquerque, and we had our first meeting. I want to recognize just some people that I call lead people and key people in the different groups that I dealt with on this. In particularly for the Bureau of Land Management, Alice Hart was the main person that I worked with in the Washington office, and she did a fantastic job in coordination with me. Neil Cornsey, our new director, seems very supportive of Native American consultation and NAGPRA items and cultural resources in general. So I'm really pleased to see Neil there. Byron Loosley, who comes from Utah, is our main archaeologist here in Washington, D.C. now for the Bureau of Land Management. And Emily Pallas has done an excellent job in working with NAGPRA items over the last several years. So the thing that we need to do is the right thing. And in my mind, the right thing is to put these remains back in the ground, where they came from, as closely as we can. As Lee said, sometimes we can't put them exactly there, but close to the area. And I don't see a problem with that. And I haven't seen a problem with that for the last 20 or 30 years. I had a lot of heartburn with the Washington office back in the mid-90s. Particularly, we were trying to rebury an individual that came out of the ground by the local deputy sheriffs. And I finally was successful in doing it, but it was worse than pulling teeth. It was just a real struggle at that time, and I'm really happy to see that there's been a change in policy. That's one thing that's great about our American government is we can change our policies, and many times they do get changed for the better. So do the right thing. It's not that hard. Cooperate with one another and get the job done. From the time of that first meeting that we had our individuals properly reburied back in the ground within 15 months. One thing that I would advise you to do if you're working with the government or with your organizations is to get buy-in right from the beginning from your managers and your supervisors. Make sure that they understand what you're doing. I went to our state director, Juan Palma, and he was very supportive right from the beginning, and just even, as I'll talk about a little bit later, provided funding for some of the studies that we did. Early meetings. This is so important to meet early and often, and that everybody's on the same page with what's going on. And we need agreement between the tribes, the museums, and the agencies. I was a little wary about approaching the tribes, about doing studies of artifacts, but I thought, well, in my mind, it needs to be done. So I asked them, and they said yes. They said as long as the associated funerary objects are not destroyed or damaged anyway, no destructive analysis, and it does not hold up the reburial process, then fine. You can go ahead and do it. And we did, and the results were absolutely amazing. We now have new information on objects that we believe are about 2,000 years old, things that have never been found before, at least known before. Many of these items have been sitting in crates and boxes, gathering dust for over 100 years. And now we're getting some real good information. For example, in one case, one place we studied, there was a feather blanket that was made with 9 different species of birds and about 300 pelts to make one blanket. A mountain lion paw sandal made with 2 paws from the lion for one sandal. The furry side down with the skin up, then another paw was skinned out, skin was put on that, furry side up, they were sewn together, and then they were lashed on top to make a sandal. Along with that, in the same area, was a mountain lion pelt, and it had been used so long by the prehistoric peoples that they actually sewed the tail back on a couple of times. So these are things that we didn't know about, the tribes didn't know about, and it's just important information. And particularly, we have one individual that's devoting her life to this. This is Dr. Lori Webster, and most museums are aware of Lori's work with perishables, and I hope she continues this on for many more years. Follow up with any tasks with due dates and written documentation. Hold people's feet to the fire. Give them a date when things are due and make sure that everybody is responsible. So we had this meeting in 2012, and there were several tribes there. Navajo, a bunch of Apaches, a whole bunch of Pueblos, looking at numerous remains that the National Museum American Indian had. And in particular, we were involved with the remains from southeastern Utah. I'd like to recognize my wife, who is my right hand in so many ways. And without her this whole reburial would not have been such a success. She's here today with me, as she usually is, and we constantly go over things and bounce things off each other. I think many times women are in the background and they just don't get the real recognition that they deserve. I think it's very important to designate lead people. You know, somebody has to be the boss. And that's for the museums, it's for the government, it's for the tribes. Somebody has to be the spokesperson that's going to really say how things get done, when they get done. So if you can get agreement on that right away at the beginning, it's a great approach to take. In our particular case, with our ancestral Puebloan remains that we had, we got everyone to agree that Acoma Pueblo would take over the lead. And in particular, Ernie Vallo Sr., this individual right here, fantastic individual, real pleasure to work with. I just had a great group of people. From the museum here, we had the repatriation people, Jackie Swift, Lauren Sig, and Terry Snowball were just amazing people. I'm really impressed with Smithsonian and the work they've done with this. Okay. Important to have a plan. And you have to be real specific in the plan and get a real good agreement between all the lead people what's going to be done. And this can be a formal document like a memorandum of understanding, or it can just be a written document that goes around to everybody. But again, everybody needs to be on the same page and know exactly what they're doing, when they're doing it, how they're doing it, what time they're supposed to be there for things. And I hate to say it, but for the most part, it worked like clockwork. Everybody did their job, and I was very impressed. We had a few snafus, as you will with any big operation, especially with 4 museums coming in from different parts of the country. But it all worked out fantastically. All right, I was asked to not only talk about how wonderful things went, but also some things we could have done better. One thing, and this was mainly my fault, is I was in kind of a catch-22 situation where I didn't want to go to the Washington office with all the details until I had them. And I had them 6 weeks before we were going to do this. And they said, "Do you want to do this when?" And again, I was just amazed that all of our BLM people really cooperated, and we got the permissions and all the, I's dotted and T's crossed and everything we had to do. And I know some of the museum people were doing things at the last minute too, but we got it done. Now, one thing we could have done better, and this I'm talking now about BLM again, is that we did not follow up with our supervisors and officials like I think we should have now, looking back at it. I was so paranoid about the press getting a hold of this, for one thing, which we did keep it quiet, and it didn't end up in the major newspapers in Phoenix or places like some of the other reburials have. And the other thing I was really paranoid about is somebody finding out the location and going back out there and digging these items up again. So we're, I think, very successful with that part of it. But our district manager immediately said, "Oh, we've got to get some press out on this and information." And I said, "No, we need to just keep this quiet." But the good news is it's not too late. I'm here today, and I'm going to make sure everybody hears about this. And I think, it's something that people need to hear about, that it can work, and it's a great thing. I talked with Jackie Swift here from the museum a couple of weeks ago about asking her about some of these things that we could have done better. And one thing that came up is that at our reburial, there were people that just plain didn't behave themselves like they should have. And I have to admit that I was one of them. I should know better, but it's hard to turn off the science, especially when, I've studied these remains for decades, and I've read numerous books on these remains, and to have them right there. So Jackie came up with this phrase, turn off the science, and I think it's an excellent one for reburials. Reburials should be a solemn funeral, not an anthropological study. So if you're from a museum or a government official out there, try not to gawk, try not to do any kind of inappropriate viewing, try not to hang around and peep over the edges to see what the people are doing that are treating these after the reburial takes place. So, and I think this should be handled, again, in a pre-meeting where you clue people into this, that, hey, this is kind of what's going to be happening out there, and let's just be respectful. Another thing we had was who attends reburials. We had, I don't want to say it, everybody and his brother, but we had a lot of people that wanted to go to this reburial. And we had to shut it off because word was getting out, keep it quiet. Some people showed up because they went to either Ernie or to a museum person and they tagged along. But again, that who is going to be there should be decided well in advance of the actual reburial taking place, just so that no one's embarrassed or irate over certain people showing up. Again, confidentiality is really important in doing this whole reburial issue. I still worry about this. We took every precaution that I think we could as far as security of where it's buried and taking measures that it will not walk away, but there's always that chance and possibility. I was very happy to see that the SHPO's office, State Historic Preservation Office, was very much in tune with the idea of keeping things quiet. Matter of fact, this project and location is a maintenance area. So, on the other hand, I know some government offices have done things where they have not recorded it, not put down where it is. And that's bad because those people are not going to be there maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now. There does need to be a record of where things are. And as Lee mentioned at lunchtime, there needs to be agreement with the government for protecting these things in perpetuity. No malls or whatever, oil pads or anything else. Future reburial on public lands, we're just getting started. Wow. I don't think anybody has any idea what we have out there. I had museums, little podunk museums from Timbuktu calling me, about, oh, we've got some human remains from southeastern Utah. It kind of spread throughout all the museum community. And we want to get rid of them. We don't want them anymore. There are untold thousands of individuals out there that have been dug up and drug off and are sitting somewhere over the last 125 years. And finally, we need to all work together, respect each other. I'm excited about this. One of the reasons I'm not retiring, again, is that I'm enjoying what I'm doing now. I think it's worthwhile. This is just one of my duties, but I think it's an extremely important one. And one of the best days of my career when I worked with a little old Wallapai lady that came up to me out on Peach Springs area where we did a reburial. And she said, "Thank you for getting our ancestor back." Thank you.
Thank you, Don. I'd like to ask Don, where does the funding come from when you conduct cooperatively a reburial on public lands? And what are the permissions necessary?
Well, as far as the permissions go, and this is good news. This is another change that at least the BLM is doing. Until the present time, and this is going to be a new policy, I understand, starting in 2015, we had, and this is we being any state, United States, the Bureau of Land Management, had to go to the Washington office and get permission, had to run everything through about 6 different people, get all the approvals and everything. Well, starting next year, they're going to allow states to do that. The state director will be able to do that. The funding for this, I felt that the least we could do was dig the hole. And digging that hole cost $2,000. Getting some of the things we needed, like special sand to put over the remains, was another, few $100s. But all in total, with time and wages and everything, I don't think we spent more than $3,000 or $4,000, which is nothing. And again, I was able to do that by going to management and convincing them that this was a worthwhile thing. It was a good, communication with the tribes. The tribes wanted to do this. And I would urge the tribes, too, to follow up and go to top government officials and say, hey, this is what we want to do. We did it, and we think it's a good thing. Otherwise, it could go back to the old days. And the solicitors might say, oh, no, we can't do that. So this is not a permanent thing. I think there's a good chance that, things can always go back to previous times.
Thank you. Lee, when you've conducted significant numbers of reburials, and can you sort of approximate what percentage of that funding to do all of that work came from Hopi and the Pueblos?
Well, we were fortunate to be able to have most of the remains in terms of reburial costs paid for by the federal agencies. The Farm Bill that recently passed has a specific allocation for NAGPRA. So with the Forest Services, that's where the money came from, with several forests, particular Coconino, with that amount of remains. The Hopi tribe invests, of course, its resources. Me and my staff are on call, and I have one of our cultural advisors on standby too, so the Hopi tribe, gives him some stipend because, sometimes we have to stay overnight, that kind of thing. So the Hopi tribe also contributes to the cost as best as we can. I'm always there from the tribe. One of my staff is always available to help as well. So yeah, it's a shared cost, but predominantly the federal agencies have paid for it.
And with museums?
With museums, when we coordinate reburials, typically either the tribes or Hopi or the museum goes, if it's a NAGPRA, they go to the repatriation grant. So we've benefited from that to conduct the reburials as well too.
Thank you. For both of you, I'd like to ask, in the last 2.5 decades, pursuant to, or I guess following what's happened since the NMAI Act and NAGPRA were enacted, what are the surprises along the way that you've encountered, or what surprised you most about this process you've been engaged in?
I think for the Hopi tribe, of course, I think we've represented the Hopi tribe really honorably. I think we displayed professionalism towards the institutions and staff. So I think the most surprising thing that happened was the reconciliation. I think when NAGPRA and the other act was being debated, you had a lot of resistance against the tribes by the museums, and the Society of American Archaeologists, for example, passed a resolution opposing it. But over time, I think we've made inroads positively. So I think today, all of the institutions I deal with, I think they've just displayed equally a lot of professionalism and respect for the Hopi people. So I think we've laid a good foundation.
Good. Don?
Well, I don't know if I'm surprised or not, but it's more frustrated, I guess. Dr. Cottington this morning talked about, they want to make sure you've got the right tribe that's going back to things. But, in light of all the evidence, it's always amazing to me that so-called scientists are so reluctant to change their views on things and even acknowledge that prehistoric peoples that are 1,000 years old are related to people that are living today in the area. Everywhere, I had a job a few years ago where I traveled over 6 different states, and everywhere I went, it was the same story. Well, these prehistoric people aren't related to the people that are living here today. And, it got ridiculous. And again, that's one thing that's changing. I see that nationwide, where, science is realizing that prehistoric peoples are related to present-day peoples. But we have a real problem with that, especially when we get back to cultural items and associated objects and burials that are a couple of thousand or 5,000 years old. Then it gets real difficult to, the older you get, to deal with that.
I think we're just about close to time, so I'm going to ask you one more question for the both of you, and that is this: in terms of impact of the 2 decades and 2.5 decades of work, what do you see as the greatest impact, either in your agency or in your tribe or Pueblo villages, from the work you've done? What has been the consequence?
I think the benefit gained is really educating ourselves and the reconciliation that I mentioned. But what's really good for the Hopi tribe was that we learned about the process, we learned about the law. We also had to deal with some difficult political issues, particularly in NAGPRA. But what is done for the Hopi tribe, in particular my advisor, my cultural advisory team, is that it's really opened their eyes as well. Because as some of you know here in this room that work with us, the Hopi tribe has also asked for specific types of studies as we prepared for reburial. And because that was of importance to the Hopi tribe and my office, we've endorsed, we're interested in dental morphology, for example, so the advisory team said, boy, I wish we could have been doing dental cast on these remains for future, perhaps, use by Hopi people. So I think in a way it's perhaps a bit progressive by the Hopi tribe to do that. We're looking at DNA now, and we've discussed DNA testing from contemporary population Hopi for another interest to us in terms of our history. We did an albinism study some years back, and they did a DNA study on Hopi albinos, and our DNA went from Hopi to Casa Grande up in northern Mexico, into Meso, to Peru, Easter Island, and Indonesia. And that contradicts that usual Bering Strait theory, because our entrada into what we call the fourth world was at the south. That's our tradition, and that alpinism DNA study confirms that. So we're interested in DNA. I want to know if I'm an Irishman.
Don?
Okay. Well, I think the greatest thing that's come about because of these laws and acts is that we're talking to one another. All these little regulations and laws that come out force the government to clean up their act and look at things, you know, and see what they've been doing and what they should be doing. And I think, you know, it's a good thing, whether we like it or not. Some government people do not like the fact that we have to talk to the tribes and consult with them on all kinds of things now. But I think it's a great thing.
Wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your attention and your considerate attentiveness paid to these two gentlemen. I think that it's an important conversation that we begin today for the next 25 or 50 years. When I listen to the work that remains to be done, 30 out of 300 inventories, for example, in Lee's case, there is much work to do, and there are many more roads to travel to get where we need to be for all of our ancestors to rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Don.